ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده، إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are and from wherever you're tuning in, watching this episode. It's great to have you with us. I'm Saf Chowdhury. I'm the host for this episode, and this is Islamic Literary Society. I just want to begin before we introduce our esteemed guest about ILS. Many of you know, many of you have been supporting it, and your support has enabled us to produce the kind of shows and episodes that we do. And I think it's important for new members that have just joined, as well as viewers that tune in that are new to Islamic Literary Society. It'd be worth me mentioning something about what we do here. So ILS was founded a few years ago, 2019, and the aim was really to promote and foster and sort of develop an appreciation of authors, not just Muslims, non-Muslims, to sort of promote their works, whether that's in classical Islamic or medieval or contemporary Islamic scholarship. And we do this, or we try and do this by way of like sort of reading groups, book launches, talks, online sort of discussions. And we also hopefully will be bringing out a journal soon. And so we really want sort of to get a kind of critical appreciation, critical engagement with authors and their works about Islam and Islam and the Muslim tradition. And our aim as well is to encourage the revival of readership, particularly of the Islamic literary heritage amongst people who are young, those who are much older and more experienced with reading. So that's sort of our main aim of why ILS was set up. And what we do really is we want to nurture an interest and zeal in the reading of Islamic texts. And you would have noticed our guests who have come on, they are scholars at the highest level, who have produced cutting edge research on Islam and the Middle East, or matters Islamicat. And so we want to sort of promote that and bring that to the fore, even if you're not an academic or you're not within formal academia. We hope that the episodes and what we do makes it accessible and relatable to you. So through the promotion of classical and modern books, interviews with authors, exploration of book reviews and audio and video material, we try and provide a platform for writers to showcase their talent. We try and be a hub for book lovers to share their book interests and showcase the best in Islamic literature and Islamic literary heritage. Through the contribution of our members, we're able to bring these kind of activities to you. So we really thank you for your support, and please continue that support, and we really do appreciate it. Now, having said all that, I don't want to waste any time. I want to get straight into what is going to be hopefully a fantastic discussion and an episode for you. I really am pleased to welcome my esteemed guest, Dr. Philip Dorroll from South Carolina. He's really been generous giving his time. Welcome, Dr. Dorroll, to our program.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. I appreciate your invitation. I mean, I'm honored that you wanted to talk to me, and I appreciate the time very much.
No, the honor is all ours, and the benefit is going to be all ours. And I hope our readers, viewers, can appreciate this episode that we've got today, because it really is it's a massive and significant contribution. And I hope over the next hour or so, we're going to bring some of this out. So let me just formally introduce our guest, and then we'll have a little chat before we begin excavating Dr. Dorroll's book. Now, some of you have been excited, I know, on the Twitter sphere and on social media. So I hope when this recording is released, you watch it diligently and really take up what the points being mentioned and take the discussion further. So Dr. Philip Dorroll is Associate Professor of Religion at Wofford College in South Carolina, USA. He's published extensively. His research has focused on the history of modern Islamic theology in Turkish, classical Islamic systematic theology in Arabic, and Eastern Christian theology in classical Arabic. He is the author of the book, which we'll be discussing today, Islamic Theology in the Turkish Republic, and he's written other articles and public writings that have appeared in venues and prestigious journals such as the Journal of American Academy of Religion, Journal of Islamic Studies, Studies in World Christianity, The Wheel, Contemporary Islam, Review of Middle East Studies, and Public Orthodoxy. His research on Islamic theology has also been translated into various languages like Albanian, Bosnian, and Turkish. Dr. Dorroll's current research and writing focuses on understanding the historical relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and Sunni Islam, and the relationship between Orthodox theology and human rights. I can go on for more, but this is just, unfortunately, a short snapshot of the work. Dr. Dorroll also has an academia page, which I'll put in the link for you, so you can access his professional research and work. Brilliant. I'm so excited. Before we kind of launch into sort of the kind of structured part of the episode, I just want to ask, so what, why Turkey, and why broadly Turkish studies? I mean, I'm an outsider. And when I read your book, I was like, it is packed full of stuff. So first of all, why Turkish studies? But why Turkey? I mean,
yeah, no, that's a good question. So the long and short of it is that I, as you mentioned in the bio, I do Eastern Orthodox studies. I'm Eastern Orthodox Christian myself. I grew up in that tradition. And when I went to college, started thinking about what to major in, what to study, whatever, I, for many years, wondered what other religions were like mine, because Eastern Orthodox Christians, I'm not going to, delay your time with the details, but of course, is part of the Eastern Christian tradition. People who fall into that category, they're Christians from the Middle East, Eastern Europe. They're not Roman Catholic or Protestant. They're a different sort of spectrum of Christian tradition. And of the people in the United States, where I'm from, obviously, who are Orthodox, we're looking at like less than 0.5% of the population.
Yeah, you're saying.
And so when I was a kid, I didn't know anybody outside of my church and my family. I didn't know anybody who was part of this tradition, but it was a big part of my life and my identity. And so when I got older, I kind of naturally was like, okay, who's like me? What, how can I analogize my experience? And I met Turkish Muslims in college, and just speaking in interreligious spaces and conversations and whatever, I began to develop the sense that I had something in common with Muslims, but also Turkish Muslims in particular, that I didn't have in common with even other Christians, because our religious culture came from literally the same places, the same parts of the earth, essentially. And then I happened to pass through Istanbul on a trip, and you do that once and you want to go back forever. And so I was like, I need to find a way to keep coming back to this town. And so I just sort of developed an interest in Turkey in general as a place. It was also it still is, but of course, this is the early 2000s, the first 10 years of 2000s. This is a very exciting time to be in Turkey intellectually. A lot of new things happening with the new AKP government.
Yeah.
So it was just a good time to be there, and a lot of things to talk about. And then when I began to focus on Islamic studies larger, I wanted to look at religious thought in Turkish. Like, what's the tradition of religious thought in modern Turkish? I like studying modern Turkey. And it just became obvious that there was an enormous body of Islamic religious thought in modern Turkish that had just never been looked at, because Turkey had, in Islamic studies, modern Turkey, so the Turkish Republic, had kind of been skipped as an area of interest for religious thought. It had been kind of dismissed in Islamic studies as a completely militantly secular space that could not by definition produce Islamic thought. And so Islamic studies, there was just this huge gap in terms of religious thought from the Republic until the present day, that no one, I did a semester in Istanbul and whatever, and it just became obvious that there was this enormous tradition of thought that had never been looked at. People knew about the late Ottoman period. They knew about the Ottoman period, of course, And then the current AKP government period got a lot of interest for political reasons, but just theology, religious thought had not been taken up.
No,
And
I
so
think,
I
you
just
mentioned that, and I'm gonna.
doing
This
it.
is what that. In fact, that might be a great way for me to sort of bring in the question that I wanted to ask. But before I do that, let me just share for our viewers just some questions I've got for Dr. Dorroll. Let me just
Yeah, of course.
share the screen. Hopefully you can see it as well. That should be visible, right?
Yes, got it.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and just folks, when you see it, this is the book. Thankfully, a paperback will be out very, very shortly. We've got our order in for it, and so it's you're gonna have to read it. I think hopefully by the end of this discussion, you're gonna see why. It's got amazing reviews. I'll put the links. I'm sure we can get links for the reviews that have come out, and it's really a massive study. And this really then leads me to sort of my first question. I mean, it's really helpful, and it's an insight into you've given us a personal insight into sort of what led you to that region, the affinities that drew you to sort of take up studies at modern Turkey. It's a fascinating book, and I mean, I guess I don't want to be presumptuous about our audience and our members, but I can only speak for myself. I really, literally am an outsider, and so for me, I guess the question is for me, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people. Can you remedy this unfamiliarity around essentially the topic of your book, which is modern Turkish theology? What is it, and why is it important for us non-Turkish outsiders who are interested, who are peering in?
Yeah. So you're right. So it doesn't have a lot of exposure, and not because I think of any particular desire or prejudice per se, but because Turkish is a language spoken by one country, and almost nothing in this genre of thought has been translated into English. I mean, it really is it's a sort of closed off world in that regard. So it's sort of natural in that respect. So when I say modern Turkish theology, I mean the tradition of Islamic religious thought in the modern Turkish language. And so we're talking about a language that is the national language of the Republic of Turkey, the modern Turkish Reformed language, so from the late 1920s, 30s until the present day. It's the language, of course, written in the Latin alphabet, like you have here on the screen. The modern descendant or the modern Reformed version of Ottoman Turkish. So it's about 100-year-old, give or take, linguistic tradition stemming from late Ottoman period up until the present day. And the word in Turkish for this tradition is ilahiyat.
Yes.
Ilahiyat literally means divinity or like matters divine. And it actually translates very well into English as theology, because we have words for this in modern English, or actually modern, but relatively modern, like a divinity school, right?
Yeah.
We have a word for this to talk about things having to do with religious thought more broadly. And so it actually it's a very effective translation into modern English theology, which means not just dogmatics, but any confessional, academic, systematic reflection on religious belief or topics. And that's what ilahiyat is in modern Turkish. And the reason why you get the word ilahiyat is it comes from, if I'm not mistaken, the earliest usage of el-ilahiyat is from Ibn Sina, referring to metaphysics, basically, or first principles, the nature of the divine. And then in the later Kalam tradition, that of course we are all familiar with, the systematic Islamic theological tradition, in Kalam, the later Kalam text following Ibn Sina, ilahiyat refers to God's nature, God's attributes, and the way that we approach them intellectually and rationally. And so that ilahiyat has that meaning in the systematic Kalam texts studied in the Ottoman period, in the madrasas of the Ottoman period. And then as you get into the modern Turkish era, and I have my book here because I took great care to get the dates right in my book, but then forgot them all right after I looked for it. So in 1864, an institution called the Darul Funun opens in Istanbul. It's the first major sort of modern university style institution in the late Ottoman period, in this Tanzim, this reform era of the late Ottoman period. And it's right in the middle of town. It's a major sort of institution modeled after the modern Western university. In 1912, it has a section established for the Ulum Isharaiyya, science of the Sharia, that is basically the Ulum ad-Din, that sort of the study of the Ulum ad-Din in a modern academic context, but the traditional sciences, but in a modern university setting or style. And then in 1924, this section is opened up again, and it's called for the first time Ilahiyat Fakultesi, Faculty of Ilahiyat. So in 1924 is the first time you get an institution where it's called a divinity faculty. And so from that point on, the 20s up until the present day, and then after the Ilahiyat Fakultesi, the Faculty of Ilahiyat at this Darul Funun, then you get a series of more that open throughout modern Turkish history. Ilahiyat faculties, divinity faculties. And from that point on, it refers to the modern academic study of all the ulum ad-Din, so tafsir, fiqh, kalam, but it also refers to philosophy of religion, history of religion, comparative religion, all the different disciplines that you have relating to religion in the modern university setting. And so basically, we're talking about a tradition of thought in modern Turkish that encompasses all of these things. We're talking about countless texts, millions of students over the course of the Republic, Lord knows how many thousands of professors and teachers. Anyone who gets a degree in one of these faculties is, of course, part of this tradition. And like I say, at the end of the book, the number of faculties, of divinity faculties in the modern Turkish Republic has, quintupled or something in the past 20 years, gone from about a dozen, I think, in the 90s up until like 60 or 70 or something now. So we're talking about thousands of students every year. And we're talking about thousands of faculty members, of thinkers, of theologians. Anyone who gets a degree there, of course, is part of this Ilahiyat tradition, but also anybody who gets a degree in any state school of religion that goes on to work in a mosque or work for the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Diyanet, anyone touched by religious academia in modern Turkey is influenced by this Ilahiyat tradition. So it's basically, to put it bluntly, or simply, mainstream academic discourse on religion in modern Turkey is Ilahiyat. And so it's an enormously important part of the country, of course, and it has deep organic roots with the Ottoman period that I wanted to sort of bring out and show. It's produced some major theologians and some major thinkers who themselves are always referencing global trends. They're always reading stuff translated from English, German, French, Russian, Arabic, Persian, whatever. But their stuff is not translated out of Turkish. So it's a very globally minded, community itself, but it doesn't get translated out of Turkish. So it's a very important community, very important tradition that's not well represented. And so I wrote the book to just basically be like, here's the outline. Here's an outline. Here's some major thinkers. Here's the major dynamics of modern religious thought in the modern Turkish language.
And that you do, I think, superbly. I mean, so it seems like this Ilahiyat is an encompassing sort of, a parameter of the way religion then is studied. That I think this probably links into sort of my next question. And hopefully then we can sort of dig in. Now, you mentioned Ilahiyat being sort of theology, but you also mentioned that at the core of not Turkish theology, but theology in the Turkish Republic, right? I remember you phrase it a certain way.
So that's a good, really quickly, just to clarify my usage. I call it modern Turkish theology because it's it's a sort of helpful way in English. In Turkish, you wouldn't, the word Turk in Turkish is an ethnic term. So you wouldn't say Turk Ilahiyat. That sounds like the Ilahiyat is an ethnicity. It sounds odd, man. You would say in Turkish, Islamic thought in modern Turkey, or Islamic theology in modern Turkey, I just condensed it because in English it doesn't sound like an ethnicity, so I just condensed it for ease of use. But it basically refers to anything in the modern Turkish language about Islam.
Yeah, I think I remember mentioning that in the introduction with the terms you use. And the introduction, by the way, if anyone who's read the book will know, it's so systematically laid out. It's like a map.
I appreciate it. Tried,
No, it really is, and it's so there's no way that you can get lost. Some introductions we know that you read and you're still not quite clear what the thesis is, and then what the arguments are that lead to that thesis, to substantiate that thesis. So it's brilliant as an overview of the book. But on the point of the ilahiyat theology, I know you mentioned that Tawheed, or Tawheed is this the central concept, and that idea of God's oneness is then somehow, intellectuals, refract this idea through their own thinking and the prisms of their own, space-time sort of location, things like that. What's Tawheed got to do with all this?
Yeah.
I mean,
So
more than Turkish theology.
Yeah. So one of my major goals was to tell this story as best I could from the Turkish historiographical perspective. So how do people in Turkey talk about their own tradition here? Like I didn't want to invent some framework that somehow was totally drawn from my, of course it's my own idea. It's I'm an outsider too. So this is all in my brain too, of course. I'm not saying I'm not an insider in that regard, but I wanted to use the indigenous framing of this as much as possible. Yeah. And so when Turkish historians, when historians of ilahiyat, these professors and these theologians talk about their own tradition, they will talk about the late Ottoman period as the beginning. So late 1800s up until the beginning of the Republic. And the most important intellectual concern for Muslim academics in this period is dealing with and combating the rise of scientific materialism, and not just like scientific thought, because all this mainstream tradition is very accepting and interested in modern scientific advances explicitly, but a sort of scientistic, aggressive, reductionist materialism becomes very popular in the late Ottoman period. And it's associated with sort of these now obscure German materialists called the vulgar materialists, like Ludwig Büchner, who weren't just scientific thinkers, but were like, everything is. He had a book called, I think it was called like Kraft und Stoff or something, like matter and force or something. Everything is just matter bumping into each other. That's it. And it was a very sort of polemical religion is at best nonsense, at worst pernicious. And this way of thinking became extremely influential in late Ottoman intellectual circles. I mean, it took over the medical faculties, it took over the scientific. So it was a very powerful strain of thought. It's hard to imagine now, but this is a very powerful way of thinking, analogous to the kind of anti-theistic or even sort of not just philosophical atheism, but like an aggressive beginning of persecution of religion, like you had in the Soviet Union. I mean, so it's that kind of thinking. In that environment, and these intellectual cadres begin to take control of the Ottoman Empire with the successive changes in government. So right when modern Turkish is coming into being as a language, modern Muslim thinkers in Turkish are like, this is our major problem. So we have to show that God exists. And we have to show that we need to believe that God exists and be convinced of it. So Tawheed, right? Tawheed. Yes. And so the basic problem, so it's a back to basics, like, how do we show God is there? And how do we show that we need to keep belief in God? And we need religion, we need faith, we need tradition in the modern world. And so that's why I sort of class this as a concern for Tawheed, because the earliest members of this modern tradition, their explicit goal is to revive Islamic religious thought, to defend it from these scientific materialist trends, and to reconstruct it in modern Turkish in a way that preserves the insights of the tradition and sort of carries it across this very turbulent period in early 20th century industrialized modernity.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely reasserting that supernatural worldview.
Exactly,
but what's quite interesting as well, as hopefully we'll touch on, and you obviously outline it in your book, is there is that supernatural, the reassertion of a supernatural worldview, but yet there's aspects that are not part of sort of eternal truths, especially politics and human. But we'll get there, and I think you bring out, I think, chapter 3 and 4. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think so we will come to that. I don't want to jump the gun for our readers and audience, but so that's brilliant. So that kind of at least now makes it clear for me anyway how sort of Tawheed then becomes the center for these theologians who are now operating from a transition to the closing stages of the Ottoman.
Yeah, that basically that Tawheed can no longer be assumed. You have to defend it. It has to be defended now.
Fantastic. Now, I mean, this is where I think, you really, really get to amazing sort of, you sort of clear the road for readers, and really shine in, clear light on the sort of influences. I mean, you mentioned, I think, in chapter 1 is called Origins. And then you argue that the modern Turkish tradition of theology, or the new emerging and then subsequent decades of theology done in this new framework, has three streams of thought, as you put it, streams of thought or influences. So one is this legacy of, you've touched, you sort of alluded to Sunni Ottoman systematic theology, or ilmul kalam. Then you've got the late 19th and early 20th century Islamic sort of modernism. And then you mention late Ottoman, early Republican Turkish sociological theory. And then you comment that these bases, quote, these bases would form the main conceptual ingredients for how modern Turkish theologians would attempt to understand Tawheed in relation to modernity, unquote. What is that about? Break that down for us. That's important.
Yeah, appreciate it. So in terms of the way that this is me trying to answer the question, what makes the modern Turkish language tradition of theology distinct, right? What makes it different from other things? And the first thing that I should have mentioned earlier is that the prominence of Kalam. First of all, Kalam is a huge part of Ottoman intellectual culture. It's not, I mean, it is in a lot of places, of course, not just the Ottoman period. But what's interesting is that the Kalam texts become seen, especially in the late 19th century, as these are the pinnacle of Islamic thought, right? These are where you find so much to work with. They're not just sort of, they're a very advanced level text, but they're seen as the basis of something new. This is what's called the new theology, Yeni ilmi kalam, this new theology movement. And so people the intellectuals in the late 19th century are consciously drawing from these texts because they were very prestigious in the Ottoman period. So the biggest names here are Giorgiani, Teftazani, and Iji. I mean, these late period Ashari and also some Maturidi Kalam texts. So that's their basis. That's what they have in front of them when modernity begins, basically, because they learned them in school. They're part of the curriculum in the Ottoman madrasas. And then the era of Islamic modernism, the movement of thinking about religion as what parts of religion are essential to it and what parts of religion of Islam are changeable historically. So the influence on historicist or historical thinking in modern Islamic thought, this occurs everywhere, of course, in the world. The Islamic modernist tradition, Muhammad Abdu's, probably the most famous example, one of the most famous examples in this part of the world. He was greatly admired by the late Ottoman thinkers. And so that becomes a very popular genre of thought in late Ottoman period. And then you have the development of this might be the most sort of Turkish part of all of it, is the popularity of sociology, especially Durkheimian sociological theory. Durkheim, I mean, you can't, for the same reason that French and German intellectuals are popular in the Ottoman period, Durkheim becomes incredibly popular. I mean, people just really enjoy reading his stuff in the elite academic circles. Like Comte. Comte was very popular for similar reasons. And so probably the most influential single intellectual in all of modern Turkey, I would say, and not just me, but at least one of them, is a guy named Ziya Gökalp, late Ottoman, early Republican period. And Ziya Gökalp was a sociological thinker. He was a huge fan of Durkheim. He translated Durkheim into Turkish, published parts of Durkheim into Turkish language in journals. And partly because Ziya Gökalp was so influential in modern Turkish thought, Durkheimian sociology just really becomes part of the way that people think here. So when you look at the earliest institutional influences, what's the stuff people are reading? What's the stuff people take seriously? It's the late Ottoman or the Ottoman intellectual heritage, It's the sort of in vogue Islamic thought of the era of globally Islamic modernism. And particularly in modern Turkish, its sociological thought is very, very influential. And the part of the argument I make is, why was sociology so influential? It's because since the mid-19th century, reformism in the Ottoman Empire was the big political question of the day. How do we change our society to re-strengthen it in the face of Western power? We the Ottomans, we used to be the ones who called the shots in European politics. Now it's the reverse. Now we're at the mercy of these West European powers that we didn't think were that big a deal for centuries. Now they're telling us what to do. So how do we strengthen our own imperial power? This sets off the famous era of reforms. Those reforms get more radical as time goes on. They accelerate faster and faster and faster and faster. And as that happens, religious thinkers are trying to keep up. What do we do about this? Do we have to reform Islam now? Like, what about Islam can change? So the question of change and permanence becomes very urgent in the Ottoman Empire, because frankly, the government is like, we got to fix stuff, we got to change things. And the religious scholars broadly agree on the need, the ulama agree on the need for change, but then it becomes, all right, what can we change? Like, what needs to be changed? What can we change? And so that sets off a discourse about change and permanence. And so sociology becomes perfect for these discussions, right? That sociology is all about social change and continuity. And so sociology becomes very influential. So I just think of these three discourses as being the ones that, if you look at the earliest beginnings of this tradition, they're everywhere. They're what everyone is kind of drawing on to make their various arguments. I think you might be muted. I believe your mute might be on. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I think you were
sorry.
on mute.
No,
Yeah,
it was me. Sorry.
No worries. No worries.
I think you mentioned in the book about Gorkup's sort of civilizational theory that he appropriates from Durkheim.
Yes,
and
right.
then that becomes sort of the kind of ideational basis for this new emerging nationalism. And then that's this new civilization. It depends on sort of cultural unity, and then this idea of religion at the root of the culture.
So Gokop, he I'm sorry if I cut you off.
Please.
So Gokop, he becomes a professor actually at the institution I was saying before, the Darul. He's a professor there, I think, starting in 1912.
Yeah.
So he's also he's influential in all of these things. And he has a very famous distinction that is influential in all of modern Turkish culture, where he distinguishes between culture and civilization. Yeah. And he says culture is a thing that is special to a group of people, a nation or whatever, but civilization is just basically human technique, human technology that anyone can take and should take.
Yes.
And so he basically draws this distinction that enables modern Turkish thought to be like, all right, we can draw on anything from the West intellectually that we identify as civilized, and it doesn't dilute our Turkishness or our Muslimness. And so it creates this intellectual culture where you can combine modern sociology, modern scientific thought, modern Western whatever with old Islamic discourses, and it's not seen as a problem, because you're taking civilization, which belongs to all of humankind, integrating it with contemporary national culture.
Yeah, because you got that sort of trinity or sort of triad of Turkification, Islamization, and modernized. I'm not sure if I'm using Islamization.
Yeah, Westernization.
Yeah.
The Westernizers, the Islamists, and the Turkish.
That's right. So you got that kind of triad working.
Right.
His sort of theory, proposing that triad. It is fascinating. His influence, as you mentioned, is immense.
Yeah.
And so I found, you see, when you put those streams of thought, those influences, when you laid it out like that, now you've got a mapping. So now as a reader, fortunately I'm a historian, I'm a history teacher as well. So we were looking for, causes and consequences. These are big ideas in history. And so when you've got them in front of you, you're like, okay, right now I can start to maybe pick this route and try and see where it takes me. And so it's really, really helpful. And it's really sort of precise in that way. I can't explain it unless our readers and viewers, who you're watching, you read the book and you see, it takes you very smoothly through these influences, and so it's so neat and tidy like that. So that's brilliant. I mean, yeah, I guess these three streams now become important for us to appreciate now this new development of sort of Turkish theology within this new Turkish Republic, and then obviously up until now. Now, here's a quote I want to read from the book, and I thought it was a very, very interesting. I'm sure when our viewers see the episode, they will find this interesting. You say, and I quote on page 53, secular Turkish nationalism aided in the growth of modern Turkish theology by providing a new social and political context for theological reaction. The conceptual shifts engendered by the nationalist context did not arrest the development of Sunni theology in Turkey, but instead helped to produce creative theological responses to the novel challenges posed by this new political environment. Modern secular Turkish nationalism did not destroy vital and profound religious thought in the new republic, as might be assumed. On the contrary, it helped infuse modern Turkish theology with its own distinct character and creativity. Now, some people might raise their eyebrows, right?
Yeah,
at that. I'm not going to lay out your argument, because you can do it much better, and you do it brilliantly when you give examples. So, how does secular Turkish nationalism enable the space and opportunity for modern Turkish theology not only to flourish but grow?
Yeah. So so I appreciate you highlighting this, because this is probably, looking back on this is probably the part of the book where I'm making, as you put it, the most, I don't know, novel or provocative or whatever kind of argument, I guess I suppose I am directly challenging most people's interpretation of this period.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So, because most people will say most people would say this is why the modern Turkish period, you don't have good religious thought, because Turkish secularism obliterates it, stagnates it, right?
Stagnation.
And you can definitely see there aren't as many divinity faculties, then as there are now, etc.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say, though, is that, but Turkish academia kept going and growing in that period. So basically, here's why I say this. After the Ottoman period ends, the modern Turkish Republic begins. The conventional historiography for many decades was this radical break, because that's how the Republic talked about itself.
Yes.
We're getting rid of all the superstitious Ottoman blah blah blah. We're new.
Yeah.
But Turkish studies and of course Turkish historians at the time knew that it was more complicated than that. That there was a lot of continuity. That the modern Turkish state was obviously very radically different in some ways, but had some major continuities. And so over time, we recognized that there's a lot of continuity between the late Ottoman period and the Turkish Republic. But that recognition somehow never extended into religion. We still kind of assumed that the religion must have still been obliterated, and now it all of a sudden got revived by the AKP or by Islamists or something.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to show is that no, there actually was a Islamic academic culture that never stopped. In other words, so the professors who were active at the Darul Funun were still professors at the New Republic. They became professors at the Ankara School of Theology, the picture that you had up, that I have in my book. Their students at Ankara became professors elsewhere. Students at a new higher Islamic institute in Istanbul that was founded shortly thereafter became professors. So there was a new system of divinity faculties growing in the Republic. So in other words, the institutional memory of the Ottoman period didn't go away. It just got transferred into modern Turkish and became part of the modern divinity system. But I think why people have neglected that is because now no one's speaking Ottoman, they're speaking modern Turkish.
Yes. And
so you have to, all the stuff is in modern Turkish. So if you don't know modern Turkish, it looks like a giant hole, a black hole, but it's in a new language. So you have to read the new language. So for instance, a good example of this that I talk about in 3 and 4 is the most famous modern Turkish thinker of all time is, again, Ismail Hakkı İzmirli.
Yes, you do mention
1869 to, again, 1940, 1869 to, what is it? I want to get it right. 1946, 1869, 1946. He taught the Darul Funun. And his major work, Yeni Ilmi Kalam, The New Theology, is published in 1923, 1924. Okay. So Ismail Haqqi Izmirli, I mean, one of the greatest thinkers in all of modern religious history, dozens of major works. He's a whole school of thought unto himself. People who studied with him or studied his works or studied in the Dar al-Funun, their students go on to keep creating things in the Republic. People like who were influenced by him, a guy named Bekir Topaloğlu, who's
you mentioned, yeah,
giant in modern Turkish ilahiyat. I mean, and Hüseyin Atay,
yes,
who's associated with the Ankara faculty, Topaloğlu with the faculty of Marmara School of Theology in Istanbul. So there is this generation right after the Ottoman period of people who are rooted in late Ottoman intellectual culture. So Ismail Haqqi Izmirli trained in the madrasas and then teaches at the modern Dar al-Funun and teaches in the Republic. And then the Republic starts, and then there's a new generation of people who learn the old style of theology. The madrasas are gone, but they still learn that old style from this memory, this expertise that still existed, of people who straddled the boundary between the Republic and the empire. And then they go on to make the divinity faculties. So in other words, there's continuity here between these two periods. So the first thing is the continuity. So that the Republic, how does it keep theology going? Institutional continuity. The institutions didn't actually go away. They just changed. They went from being madrasas to these new theology faculties. Fewer, of course, but they're very intellectually sophisticated, very powerful, and do a lot of interesting work. So institutional continuity is there. That's the first important thing. The second thing is the national state context also encourages people to think in new ways about new social problems. So in chapter 2, I talk about how coming from the West, new social, I don't want to say new, but newly framed social values, freedom or liberty, more accurately, liberty, hürriyet, equality, justice, equal treatment under the law. These are concepts that are very enthusiastically embraced by the Ottoman intellectual elite, very enthusiastically. And that enthusiasm carries over into the Republic. And now there's a place where you have Muslim academics who are not just free, but encouraged to find connections between modern questions of state governance and the Islamic tradition.
And the idea of adalat you mentioned here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Adalat, the sort of the coming from Arabic for justice.
Yes.
So now there's a context where now there's a reason and a good reason to try and draw connections between Islamic traditional discourses and modern state governance. And this is still a repressive climate. Okay, this is still up until the 1950s, it's a very repressive climate. After the 1950s, when the theology faculties begin to be built and be restarted, you have a new environment where there is actually a lot more freedom, a lot more ability to pursue these topics. So that's the other thing, is that there is a repressive secularism that's operative, but after the 50s, it's not nearly as serious as it was before, and academia restarts. And now it restarts, and now we have people talking about all these different questions, all these different these issues that the late Ottoman period left for people to talk about. So the institutional continuity, there's an encouragement and a reason to really talk about modern social questions in dialogue with traditional Islamic thought. And another thing I would say is that now that the national community is everyone's frame of reference, it encourages you to go find things you might not have thought about before. So for instance, in modern Turkish national cultural identity, Central Asia is part of the cultural heritage, part of national heritage.
Yeah.
So Abu Mansur al-Maturidi from contemporary Uzbekistan. Already in the late 19th century, Ottoman theologians are like, you know what? He's one of ours. He's Turkish. He's part of our heritage. He's part of our cultural heritage somehow. And so that begins as late as the 19th century, but over the course of the 20th century, there is this building interest in Maturidi in modern Turkey.
Unparalleled anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And why? Because the Turkish Republic decides he's Turkish. I mean, simply put, without the Turkish Republic national framework, he would not have been seen as of interest. He would have been forgotten.
You mentioned that as not a discrimination in a negative sense, but this is if you want to start to now appropriate things for your national heritage, or what are you going to anchor your heritage in? Your argument was, this nationalism allowed it to take Maturidi as part of their
Exactly.
And yeah,
So, and this is not to say that the negative aspects still weren't there. I mean, other stuff I've written deals a lot with the negative aspects of Turkish ethnic nationalism, but this particular development is worth talking about. And it basically says that Maturidi is now part of our heritage, and we have to go develop this. And so what you have is, beginning with Bekir Topaloğlu.
Yes.
You have editions of, he wasn't the first to do a modern edition of Maturidi, but his co-author Muhammad Arutça is definitely the best. His translation of Kitab at-Tawhid is sublime. I mean, it's incredible. Like, it's an incredible text, unmatched. He leads the way in doing an edition in modern Turkish translation of all of the Ta'wilat to the Quran. So now, thanks to this national consciousness, one of the greatest systematic theologians of all of Muslim history, Maturidi, now all of his extant works are in modern Turkish. They're read all the time by people. And there are literally thousands of monographs, articles, dissertations on his work alone. There's a whole new genre of Islamic thought birthed in this environment, simply because of the Republic.
Yeah, that's interesting, that argument, for sure. I mean, a product of this sort of reimagination of Turkishness is
right.
It's now, you start to now look for these components that form your now national identity. And so it's interesting that Sunni, classical Sunni Maturidi theology, or Maturidi himself, becomes the kind of the flag bearer of this new nationalism.
Yeah, I would say, I'll put it this way. These scholars would not call themselves nationalists. They wouldn't say
okay,
nationalists.
yeah.
But some would. There is a sort of extreme fringe of this that sort of take it all the way and be like, Ataturk and Maturidi were the same, which is a whole different thing. But that exists. But like, whatever. But what they would say, though, is that Maturidi is part of our cultural heritage, and we need to revive him as a way of talking about what it means to be Muslim in the Republic today.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. Because Ottoman, often the association in the general Muslim's mind is, Ottoman, the Ottoman territories were Hanafi, Maturidi, but of course there's Ash'ari. There's been a huge Ash'ari influence, and then obviously some synthesis with Ibn Arabi, so the Akbari tradition. In the late period. So that's just so people know the context of the quote is in that. I mean, there's not a sweeping statement.
It's not that secular nationalism, produces all kinds of religious thought per se, but it reframes the way you think about yourself. And in doing so, you rediscover these things that you wouldn't have the reason to think about before. And one of these things happened to be one of the greatest traditions of Islamic thought in history. And so it's thanks to the modern Turkish tradition that we have. And unfortunately, so little of that is in English. I mean, all this stuff.
You mentioned that you're one of the only people, probably one or two hands.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
But if nothing else, I want people to know that there is this whole universe of Muslim academics talking about Maturidi and doing everything you can imagine with his thought in this culture.
Brilliant. Now, jumping on to chapter 3 and 4, which are sort of two sides of the same coin, sort of thing, or two they are intertwined because you're looking at two facets. In those two chapters, you explore how these new theologians, whether they're from the residue of the empire or the caliphate, or they're straddling this sort of transition period, or even the new theologians that weren't under the old Ottoman governance, I guess these two chapters show something perennial with Islam's encounter with modernism. So here, and I'll read the quote in a bit. I mean, it looks like, if I can summarize it, and please tell me if I'm butchering it. So, these Turkish theologians, they want to sort of negotiate this idea of Tawhid, which we talked about earlier, in space-time. So you've got God the eternal, and you've got eternal truths of the religion of Deen, as you mentioned. How does that relate to the temporal, the changing. So how does the unchanging and the changing relate? What parts remain unchanged? What parts remain changed? And this seems like, across the Muslim world, the same sort of negotiation was taking place. What parts are fixed? What parts are not? And so this quote here, there are lots of parts that I could quote, but just, this is just one. You say it, and I quote, modern Turkish theology, therefore, seeks to identify which elements of Islamic religious tradition are eternally valid and thus cannot be changed, and which elements are liable to change in accordance with the rapid transformation of modern social life. It's theologically problematic. The definitions of relationships between the changing and the unchanging within religion is a direct result of the dramatic social change wrought by the founding of the Turkish Republic, is what makes modern Turkish theology distinctive. It explores this theological problematic precisely because the very language that it is expressed in, modern Turkish, was born in an era of dramatic and revolutionary change. So what's this negotiating, unchanging, changing aspect? What's this whole thing that the theologians have taken up? What is this?
I'll say my argument real quick, and then I'll summarize how I got there. So my argument is that this basic, like you pointed out, this basic problematic of modern religious thought in general, what is essential to us and what can change with the times, to put it sort of crudely, I argue is particularly acute and explicit in modern Turkish thought. It's very explicitly dealt with. And the reason why, because the social change happening in modern Turkey was so unbelievably profound. It happened everywhere, but in modern Turkey, you have new language, new laws, it's just everything changes in about 10 years. You have a whole new society in many ways. Same institutions, very new society. So that's my major argument, is that this bigger universal problem is more acutely and explicitly discussed in modern Turkish. And the reason why I say this is because, again, looking at the modern Turkish tradition's history of itself, talking about where did our ilahiyat come from, they often identify these two theologians that I talked about, Bekir Topaloğlu from Istanbul and Hüseyin Atay from Ankara, as sort of touchstones for the beginning of two general tendencies. I didn't talk about this in the book explicitly because it's not really an academic posit or like a formal argument, but there's this general sense that like there's an Istanbul and Ankara stream of ilahiyat, very, very vaguely speaking. It's much more complex now, but especially in the 20th century. And that is, there's one side, the Istanbul side, the Marmara University side, the Bekir Topaloğlu inspired trends of thinking about what it means to be modern in explicit connection with the traditional, like taking traditional discourses, understanding them in their own way, and then bringing them into modernity, right? The Ankara side is like changing traditional discourses, revolutionizing them, explicitly modernizing them in some way, or to put it more bluntly, or to put it more empathetically, or more in that tradition's terms, how can we use traditional Islamic texts, taking their spirit and making new answers, very new answers to old questions?
And that's a secular endeavor, that one.
So basically, these two possible kinds of thinking, being traditional in a modern setting or using modernity to rethink tradition, are the sort of two major thought streams that you have in the modern period in Turkey. And so I look at these and I think, therefore, what does the whole of the modern Turkish tradition have in common? They're constantly thinking about this change permanency dialectic. And indeed, if you go back to the beginning of this tradition, the Darul Funun, one of the first things it did in the Republican period in 1928, they put out a report literally talking about, here's how we should change Islam. Here's what we should do here's our contribution to religious reform. And it was the most radical kind of document ever produced in that regard. It was a document that said we should do the azan in Turkish, for instance. It was a document that said we should wear shoes in the mosque. We should have pews in the mosque. I mean, all these things that never took off, obviously. The azan did until 1950. But a lot of this stuff never got implemented because it's so beyond the bounds of what was possible. But what it did do was basically set off this discourse of, all right, we need to draw the boundaries, right? We need to stop this somewhere. The reform discourse has to have a limit. What is the limit? Where do these things stop? And so you begin to have this this crystallization of here's the essentials and here's the stuff that can change. And the essentials broadly get to be understood as essentially ibadat, or ibadah, and i'tiqad, itiqad.
Yeah.
So belief and worship, the fundamentals of belief and basic worship, that stuff doesn't change, right? That stuff is the essentials of Islam. We don't change that. We simply cultivate that in modernity. However, there's this other sphere, social questions, political questions. That stuff is inherently changeable. And that basic argument, you find it in Izmirli, in his new Kalam, Kalam, he says there's three kinds of religious judgments, which he gets from older texts, of course. I think you probably find it in Jurjani, but I'm not sure. But it's definitely older than him. He's like, creedal judgments, itiqad, don't change. They're about conforming your reason to Islamic truth. Moral principles, akhlaq, don't change, because loving kindness, mercy, justice, we're always going to have to do those things.
Yeah,
that's about reforming your heart, your qalb, to the truth of Islam. There's a second category, judgments of action, of things you do in the world. And inside that second category are two things: worship and mu'amalat, right? The
transactional. Yeah.
Transactional. And he explicitly says worship stuff does not change. The transactional stuff, that by definition, and he uses the word, changes.
Yes.
And from this period in the 20s on, I began to see it everywhere. Every major modern ilahiyat thinker who's prominent in their field at some point begins to address this discourse. And there's like 5 or 10 different words in Turkish for permanent and changeable that just show up over and over again. And so they constantly are trying to negotiate, and they have different versions of it. Some Ankara theologians have a very extreme version where the unchangeable is like this almost personal religious faith and everything else can change. And then the other people who do fiqh, for instance, have a much narrower vision, potentially, of what can change. But there emerges this consensus, at least that I think is there, on we have to identify these two realms. And it comes from these late Ottoman discussions. It brings together the questions of sociology, of modernism, whatever. But we have to think about what goes into which box. And broadly speaking, there is this consensus of belief and worship. Those things constitute this eternal sense of Islam that we're not going to change, or we're not going to fundamentally alter, especially not belief, but certainly worship as well. But when it comes to society and politics, then we have these debates.
Yes,
and this is why,
and governance. You mentioned that
statecraft, governance, and this is the answer to the question that people have asked for a long time. Why is the concept of secular democracy uncontroversial in modern Turkey? Now, what that looks like is obviously debated, and you can lean to authoritarian versions of this, obviously. But the idea of having a secular representative democracy in and of itself is not a controversial idea, and has never been really in the Republican period. Everyone thinks it's a good idea in theory. And I would argue it's because early on, mainstream Islamic ilahiyat in Turkey said it's part of this realm that just is technique. It's, to go back to Ziya Gökalp, it's civilization, right? That stuff we take whatever works. Doesn't matter where it comes from. And so that's my argument, is that this changeable, unchangeable dynamic becomes just part of basic common sense in modern Turkish thought, and everyone has a way of negotiating it. And if you sort of take that as the basis, then you can begin to categorize different thinkers. How do they talk about this? And it doesn't encompass everything. It's not absolute. But it's a kind of heuristic for how do you map out this bigger tradition? Because ever since the Ottoman period, because the Ottomans were obsessed with this toward the end of the empire, the great thinkers were obsessed with it toward the end of the empire. If you look at that as a heuristic, change in permanence, you can begin to map out where different people fall on these.
Yeah, we see this being replicated across the Muslim world, don't we?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So from West Africa to all the way to India. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I know I'm keeping an eye on time, but I want to sort of pull you into sort of a couple of last questions, if that's okay. Now this is the last chapter was interesting. I thought, you and I just have to say this for our readers: there is so much in the book. There are figures I haven't mentioned. There are scholars Dr. Dorroll brings to the fore for the very, very first time. who I don't think English read, unless those who know Turkish.
No, I made an effort to, I mean, because none of it's translated to begin with, with the exception of maybe one or two people, I think everyone I talk about there, nothing has been translated from their work. So
yeah. So you know, in effect, this is the very first time we're getting these thinkers and their views. And I haven't mentioned it, so unfortunately I've kept it in broad strokes, just so we can get an appreciation of the books, and it's going to be up to our viewers, and you know, sort of dive in and sort of get into the to the meatier parts of the thoughts of the intellectuals that's mentioned in the book. Now the book, as you know, you mentioned a few of them, is rich in dichotomies, you know, that someone like a historian like myself would relish: change, continuity, permanence, impermanence, you know, core historical ideas like causation, consequence, significance, perspective, all these kind of things. And these help us outsiders, you know, non-specialists, to frame these issues that you're bringing to the fore for the very first time for many of us. And so in your final chapter, you know, you examine the Turkish state as an actor, and then the effects of the intervention of the Turkish state as an actor, and how that intervention affects the nature, internalization, and reception of theology and the direction of theology, especially inclusion and exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a bit more on this? What's the state doing? What's this Turkish statism that you're talking about in theology? What's the relationship?
So one of the, just speaking, going back to the issue of continuity, the greatest continuity, I think, it's fair to say, between the Ottoman and the Republican period is devlet, is the state. Devlet in Turkey. And modern Turkish studies, I mean, this is just the one of the overriding themes of modern Turkish anything is devlet, because that is what carries over. And I think people who study early Ottoman period would argue there's continuity between even the Byzantine state and the you know, right. There's a long tradition of centralized states in this territory is very, very old, right? I mean, the Ottoman Empire itself is a development of the old Roman, the Byzantine states in some ways. So the Turkish government is an extremely centralized state and has been at least since the Ottoman period. And so when you get to the Republic, all of the big state institutions of the Ottoman period, they change their names, they have maybe different functions, but they carry over. The state does not go away. A lot of things go away, a lot of things change, the state does not. Devlet is constant. And the idea that the state is the main mechanism of governance and justice for society is an absolute just assumption among modern Turkish history, coming from the Ottoman period. Ottomans, as we all know, had a very strong centralized state. Yes. And that's just how they ran. That's how they ran things. So what this means is that the state in modern Turkey, as in the Ottoman Empire, reserves to it, and the Byzantine Empire, for what it's worth, reserves to itself the right to manage religion, because religion is seen as a potential ally or challenger of the state. Ottomans certainly felt this way. The Republic felt this way, but then enhanced that assumption with the kind of famously the French laicist model, laiklik in Turkish. Mm-hmm. So the Republic sort of takes that old Ottoman idea of the prerogative of the state over religion and enhances it with the French laicist model and says the state has a duty to control religion, not just manage it, but control it. And so the Turkish state arrogates to itself the responsibility and the right to control religious functions in the country. Every Sunni institution in the country, to be legal, has to be approved by the Central Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Presidency of Religious Affairs, the famous Diyanet. So in that context, theology is deep. So my question for the last chapter was, all right, what's the major factor that will influence the future of theology in Turkey? And it's kind of the old answer, but I'm trying to use the basic answers here in the field. It's the Turkish state. I mean, that's the main influence on so many things in modern Turkish life. And so the early republic to the present day has always managed religion and managed religious thought according to what it feels is appropriate or effective. Mm-hmm. So these divinity schools, they're funded by the government completely. The government, again, retains the right to control their administration, and has, again, being a republic, they have influence. The Turkish parliament passes laws that directly influence the administration of higher education. And so just structurally speaking, statism, the centrality of the state in modern Turkish governance, influences the way that theology works. So I basically just give a few examples of how theology was decisively moved in different directions, or the possibilities of theology were moved in different directions by the state. And it's not like the state, it's not like the modern Turkish state has absolute totalitarian control. It just simply gives itself the right to intervene when it deems it necessary. And so it intervenes, like the famous military coups. It intervenes when it feels like it can or should. So I give a few examples in the last chapter of where the state has basically intervened and said, we're going to sort of tip the scales or help grow something in ilahiyat that wasn't there before. To use so in the 20th century, it was state sponsorship for these highly radical modernist strains. 20th century, the state really builds up and sponsors the most radically modernist strains of Islamic thought in Turkey, because it's seen as compatible with Kemalism by the Turkish state. Whether or not it was is a whole different question, but the state feels comfortable with it. But the problem with that was it shuts out and delegitimizes and harms more conservative forms of expression. And the AKP, the current ruling party, is a good example of this in both directions. So the last chapter talks about how in the first 10 years of AKP governance, there's this enormous explosion of freedom of expression, of democratization, of consolidation of democratic norms that have been growing for a long time, but are really emphasized and strengthened. And you have this huge growth of divinity faculties, like they just quadruple practically overnight. And you have a true renaissance in Islamic thought in Turkey in the first 10, 15, 20 years of the AKP's administration. And so this has a huge positive effect. Like there's all this new scholarship, this new academic research that is just, highly sophisticated, rooted in all of these old traditions, that was never possible before. And an example that I use for the sake of this argument is building on other people's original scholarship is the growth of female religious authority in the Diyanet system, where Turkey has this network of women preachers and teachers and theologians that are all funded by the state, that were consciously cultivated by the state. This is people like Chiara Maritato, Fatima Tutuncu, and Mona Hassan wrote a series of really good articles about this growth of female professional clerical class in Turkey that was consciously cultivated by the new AC. So that's an example of how. So now, for instance, students in the divinity faculties are majority female, if I recall correctly. At least half, but probably majority by now. I think a strong majority. So this whole Ilahiyat universe I'm talking about right now, as we speak, is majority female in the students. Certainly 50-50, but in many cases, majority female. And so this intellectual culture has radicalized gender equality in religious authority in Turkey because the state wanted that to happen. So that's a very powerful example of how the state can really sort of positively influence things in Turkey really quickly because it has that power. I give a sort of negative example in a sense that but then if the state wants to use that power to restrict certain kinds of thought, it can do the same thing. Yeah. In 2008, again, building on other scholars' research to give an example here, but also my own readings of some contemporary thinkers talking about this, like Hayrettin Karaman, who's a very famous conservative pro-AKP theologian in this system. There was a moment around 2010, 2008, 2010, when LGBT affirming theology began to be translated into Turkish and discussed in Turkish. And pro-AKP voices like Hayrettin Karaman produced a series of articles that just absolutely shut it down. And when it became clear that the AKP was like, we're not going to support this, we'll support other kinds of new developments, like even things approaching Islamic feminism, but we're not going to support this. A few years after that becomes clear, it's gone. I mean, the funding dries up, it becomes a taboo topic in the school, you know what I mean? So basically the state has a power to say, we will cultivate these trends, and then those trends just have all kinds of influence. And then if the state says, we don't like this, that will wither and will go away. So I'm basically arguing that the potential for creativity in modern Turkish thought is limitless because the tradition has so much to work with. but the only limit that it has is the state. The state has the power to curtail or to empower different ways of talking about Islamic identity in Turkey.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I mean, you brought out all the sort of complexities that a Turkish theology reflects in how this fundamental sort of beliefs of Islam how it has its permanence, but then what aspects then when it comes into contact with modernity, what aspects become negotiated. I mean, that you brought out the nuances and complexity of that brilliantly in the book, and this episode has not done justice to that rigor and detail in the book. I mean, I guess before we sort of wrap up, one of my parting, I guess, questions would be is the conversations that you take up, the arguments that you make in your book. How would you like to see them? So be taken forward. What would you like to see? By showcasing modern Turkish Islamic theology and the kind of the things that they're grappling with and the conclusion that they've come to. What would you like to see travel further from your book?
So, I mean, yeah. So I tried to write the book as accessibly as possible, so people who weren't even in Islamic studies could read it. So, like in the introduction, I talk about how whenever I introduce a technical term, even like the word Sharia,
yes,
I define it and have some resources in the back that you can. So I try and make it that if you've never even read technical Islamic vocabulary, you can follow along. So the point of the book, and the book is structured like a series of it's thematic, but a series of summaries of major arguments of major thinkers. So it's kind of like a catalog in some ways. Like here's the major topics, and here's a bunch of arguments from major thinkers addressing this topic. So it covers, all these different schools of thought, from feminism to traditional from feminism to like fiqh reasoning, all these different kinds of thinkers talking about these shared issues. So I hope that it's just basically you can just go through it and just find arguments about these major topics in Islam, but modern religion, that are just interesting. How do you deal with the state? How do you deal with gender identity? How do you deal with proving God's existence, the proofs for existence of God? You can find little examples and summaries of all these different possible arguments in the book, and that's what I was trying to sort of provide. What I want to sort of maybe to carry through is just to sort of think about modern Turkey when it comes to Islam as not simply a place to prove or disprove our hopes and dreams for Islamic governance or Western governance. I mean, we have often talked about modern Turkey as a place where it proves somebody's political argument, right? It shows that secularism is good, or it shows that Islamic democracy can work. We have these sort of hard political dichotomies of Turkey proves this for our politics. That's how I think people have typically approached Turkey, as it proves an argument for or against a political argument. So my major message, I guess, would just be to look at Turkey as a tradition of Islamic practice and thought, and look at it as a place where you can learn something about religion in general and Islam in general. It's not a place tainted by secularism in some irretrievable way. It's also not a place where it's just all about Islamic politics, right?
Yeah.
It talks about God, about the tradition, about the Sharia, about worship, about all these different things. And it talks about them in ways that are indigenous to the context, but also in conversation with the rest of the world. So it's basically just saying, when you look at Turkey, and maybe when you look at any country, right? Like look for how these places talk about their own faith, and not look at it as a place to as a proving ground for broader political questions. And of course, like, I'm the last person to preach that message, because I do that with my own tradition all the time. But so I mean, it's not like that, we all do this, but it's an ideal that I come nowhere near living up to. But I think the only message of the book is, look at Turkey, look at other places as what is their faith doing? How are they talking about it? And if you just sort of, how do they talk about God? How do they talk about religion? You'll find all different kinds of arguments and questions that can inform the way that you think about religion, however that is, that you may not have been able to see before.
Brilliant. No, it's been fantastic. Even in this short time, it really, really has been amazing. And I can only say, get the book.
It's cheap now, $20.
Yeah. I was just about to
Very
say it is.
inexpensive now, yeah.
Thankfully now, you know, the paperback version is out, and at a considerably reduced price, you know, and so, but still get it if you know, while you can, the hardback if you're able to. It'll be, you know, it's been fantastic. Just, you know, it's been so enlightening reading it, and it's going to be a mainstay without a doubt, in the field. And you know, people are going to be building on this for, you know, in their research work, for years to come. And I just thank you for giving us the time. There will probably going to have to be another episode on maybe, you know, going into some of the specific figures and intellectuals, so we can get so some of our viewers who are sort of perhaps more familiar with the terrain and the field can make, you know, sort of better appreciation of the sort of finer details. But we've been honored to have you, and for giving us an overview of the book and the main discussions. And it just, you know, remains me to again to thank you, for doing it, giving your time, and you know, and for our audience and our members and our viewers who are supporting us, for allowing us to have these kind of episodes. So until our next one, thank you all, and please do, you know, spread the word of the book and the conversations and the points being mentioned. Please take up the discussion further, in your own way, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده، إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب.